Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee today,
Yeah.
and I think we make our furthest excursion out of British Columbia that we've done in a long time, all the way to the Central Prairies.
Yes, we go into Saskatchewan, we go into Batoche, and we go into Fish Creek and Frog Lake and all that old Northwest Rebellion country, and we look at a very fascinating individual who was known throughout the width and breadth of the plains, right from Montana right through to Saskatchewan to Alberta, Gabriel Dumont.
Now, I would have thought at that introduction that Louis Riel. Now, Gabriel Dumont, do you think is an equal character?
Most definitely.
All right, Gabriel Dumont in the Central Prairies, right after we take this break in Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We're talking today about Gabriel Dumont. He was a Métis, born in 1837, died in 1906 of natural causes.
In his 70th year,
All right. Now, what made him such an impressive character?
Well, I think a number of things. His mother was a Sarcee Indian. His father was French, so he's a Métis. And he was with the Métis bands who foraged all through the prairies. And their staff of life, how they made their living, was hunting the buffalo, taking out horses and Red River carts to carry the carcasses and the meat back and so on and so forth. And his first foray really was with his father. He was 3 years old, and they went out onto the Great Plains and met the Sioux on that particular trip. And the Sioux considered that this was sacred territory. The buffalo were theirs. They felt that the Métis were interlopers. In fact, what happened later, Mike, and I think I should mention it, about 1850, they had a massive battle with the Sioux when they went into what the Sioux considered their hereditary area. And the Métis were very, 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 very sharp. They had their Red River carts, and they circled them. And they put all of the oxen in the center and all the horses in the center because they're most important. And outside that circle of Red River carts, they dug very hastily some rifle pits. So there were 8 or 10 or 12 riflemen out there. So that's the first line of defense. And the second and last line, of course, are the Red River carts. And the Sioux were attacking us, and the most skilled horsemen in the world, of course, the Sioux and the Blackfoot and all those Plains Indians. They were attacking and circling this. But it wasn't very effective. Generally, the Métis were better armed. And when they were better armed, of course, it took a significant toll. And the result was, of course, that 18 Sioux warriors were killed. 18 Sioux warriors, and about 45 were wounded. And the Métis suffered one casualty, only one, a guy called Malaterre, and they had, I think, 3 wounded.
So that must have been a pivotal point in the Sioux's relationship with the Métis. The Sioux could say, we're either going to continue to lose all these people or we're going to reach some kind of a peace treaty with the Métis.
Precisely what the Métis did. They inaugurated a parley with the Sioux, but some of the Sioux had long memories. They knew that Gabriel Dumont had been first and foremost in the battles with the Sioux, and they went into attempt to hold this parley, and they more or less covered over all their differences, agreed to live side by side, and by that time, 1858, there was starting to be some problems with the buffalo, not significant yet, but it became increasingly so. But as Gabriel emerged from the tent, they struck him, one of the Sioux warriors struck him over the head, waiting for him outside, knocked him to his knees, leveled his rifle at his head, pulled the trigger, and it misfired. And the other Sioux grabbed the rifle off this individual and saved Gabriel Dumont. But Dumont was very, very similar to his ancestors. He was big, he was barrel-chested. He was the ultimate plainsman. He could speak 6 languages. He was a crack shot. He was a great tracker. He could call buffalo with his mouth.
What is a buffalo? I mean, I'm not asking you, but he had conquered it, and buffalo would come at his beckon.
At his beckon, and very few people could do this, so it was really quite amazing.
Now, you were telling me about just how vast some of these hunting trips were.
Sure.
For example, I think you said about 400 hunters went out on one trip.
Yeah, that was 1840.
How many buffalo would they get in a day?
Well, they killed thousands of buffalo, but their best day, the 400 hunters, and there were good hunters and bad hunters, they killed 1,375 buffalo.
Now, would they be able to utilize that? I mean, picture the
very
number
well.
of Red River carts you'd need to go out on the prairies to pick up all those carcasses.
Sure. Turn that into pemmican, use the fur. The buffalo was a walking department store, you know, and it served the Indians and the Métis and the half-bloods equally well. There's no doubt about it.
Now, I guess, and as we see, and as you already alluded to, the buffalo were the staff of life, and I don't know, there are some people who even say that the numbers of buffalo were being decimated just by the native people out there, but they sure got decimated when Europeans began going across and knew they wanted to put a railway across the prairie or habitation across the prairie.
And when you take a look, Mike, when you take a look at the Plains Indians of the times, and this is a shot of the Plains Indians in the 1870s or 1880s. And you look at the vast herds of buffalo, which by the 1860s were disappearing at an alarming rate.
Yeah.
And by 1870, one of the reasons why the Métis and Riel started really the first Riel Rebellion. And that, of course, was at Fort Garry in Manitoba, not in Saskatchewan. And that was, but that first rebellion was not successful.
Now, before we just go to that, I mean, what was the basis of the rebellion? Was it based on buffalo, or because the natives were finding their lives changing so much, was it based on something else?
It was a dual thing. The buffalo were disappearing by 1870 very quickly, and land was becoming increasingly important, so that the Métis had camped on land in various parts of Saskatchewan and in Manitoba as well. The government ignored this age-old occupation of the land, which in some cases had been generations of the same family, and that's basically why the first Riel Rebellion started. And it simmered all through from 1870 to 1885.
Now, Riel, actually, he was a very substantial man. Wasn't he elected? He became an MP.
He was officially elected, and then the election was overturned by the federal government. And then he retreated to Montana, certainly was paid to go to Montana, went to a place called Sun City where he taught an Indian school with his new wife and two small children. And by 1885, the Métis, under Gabriel Dumont, had made a number of approaches to the federal government about the land problems they were having. The federal government ignored them. So as a last resort, Dumont felt that he would have to go and see Riel to force the federal government to the table.
Yeah.
So he made the trip from Saskatchewan down across into the Montana border and went down into Sun City and the St. Peter's Mission School down there. And Riel at first was reluctant, but Dumont knew that he needed Riel. Riel was very eloquent. He was a visionary. He was rather distraught at times, so he wasn't as well balanced as Dumont. There's no doubt about that. Dumont was a leader of men. Riel was a leader of vision, of thoughts, and so he went down and persuaded Riel to come back to Saskatchewan, which Riel wasn't supposed to do.
Now, old Dumont, by this time, I mean, he'd had to give up his hunting business because there weren't any buffalo anymore.
By 1885, Gabriel Dumont, the great hunter of the plains, was now a ferryman and a storekeeper. He had a little store up there. He had a big pool table in the store, and he sold flour, and he sold trinkets, and he sold all sorts of supplies that the settler needed. And he had a ferry across the Saskatchewan River.
And he knew that the Métis had a legitimate right to land, but the government wasn't negotiating with anybody. So he gets Riel to come back.
And they go back to Batoche, which is sometimes, which was really the gathering place of the Métis at that particular
sort of their
time.
capital city.
And literally hundreds and hundreds of Indians, Métis, and half-bloods. Now, the Métis generally are referred to as the French and Indian, and the half-bloods or the half-breeds are English and Indian. And, of course, then you had the three great confederacies of the plains, really in that part, were the Cree, that's the Plains Cree, and that would be under Poundmaker, and that would be under Piapot and Big Bear, and of course the Blackfoot Confederacy.
This and the Sioux would be in there too?
They would be aside though. They were different than the Blackfoots. The Blackfoot Confederacy would be the Bloods and the Sarcee to a degree, and the Pagans and the Blackfoot proper. And then, of course, the Sioux, the seven various nations of the Sioux, which would be the Teton Sioux and so on, the Dakota Sioux and so on. And his grand vision, and Dumont was right, some of these tribes were literally starving. Certainly Poundmaker and Big Bear's Crees were starving. And the Sioux, Some of the Sioux weren't in much better shape. Remember, this is 9 years after Custer's last stand on the Little Bighorn of the Greasy Grass. This is 1885, and that took place in 1876. So they're in very, very bad shape. They know something has to be done. Generally, they are being ignored. Dumont feels that if he can get a grand alliance together of the Métis, of the half-breeds, of the three major Sioux nations, at least the major Indian nations, the Sioux, the Blackfoot, and the Cree, as well as the Stonies and some of the other appropriate tribes that are smaller in number, that he will be able to draw the federal government to the table. I think his strategy was right, but it didn't quite work. After this great meeting at Batoche, where Riel fires up and delivers a passionate speech, not much doubt about it, according to the people who were there, he delivers a passionate speech, forms a provisional government, and here's the provisional government that Riel forms in the Batoche area.
And that's the Council of Batoche, they call it.
That's correct. This is the Council of Batoche. But it didn't quite come off.
The government wouldn't listen still.
This government wouldn't listen because Crowfoot, who was probably the linchpin of the whole thing, the key to it, and he was leader of the Blackfoot Confederacy, didn't come over. He felt, I believe, and I'm reading something into his mind, but certainly from later statements, that it would never work. They were simply outnumbered, and they couldn't effectively persuade the government to come to the table. So they stood aside watching it. The Sioux generally did not come there either, with the exception of one band under a Sioux chief called Whitecap. And some of the Cree did. Some of the Cree did. And certainly Big Bear's band came over, and Poundmaker's band came over.
Plus the Métis, but no
Plus
English half-breeds.
60% of the Métis.
Okay, 60%.
Not all the Métis.
Okay. And this group, what did that number, would you say? I mean, where would you...
350 maximum warriors, that is, and soldiers. That's all.
Now, they used one other technique. They just didn't embark on a battle. They took over a bunch of trading posts.
That's right.
Now, were these Hudson's Bay, or what
no,
was...
mostly free traders and Indian agents and so on. And they decided to focus the government's attention on it. They would take over some of these trading posts near and around Duck Lake. And there was a huge mounted police detachment at Duck Lake. We have no photograph of that, but there's a similar one. Here's another one about the same time, and this is Fort Walsh. And this gives you an idea of the establishments of the mounted police at this particular era.
And they wore the red serge, and
Sure
they were the force on the prairies.
You bet they were, and very well respected, even by the Métis and by the Indian nations generally.
And these traders obviously said, hey, the Métis have just taken over all their things, you got to help us.
And the traders were captured and held hostage, and the stores were in essence looted. And so the superintendent, or the inspector at the time, was Inspector Crozier. He got 56 Northwest Mounted Policemen together, hastily, which I think was a mistake, and about 43 volunteers from Prince Albert. So we have 99 or 100 men. They march out to take back the stores. The Métis are still willing, and I think this is a fair statement, to negotiate. They send out two individuals. One is a brother, Isidore, of Gabriel Dumont. They ride out under a white flag. They start to negotiate. Somebody fires a shot. I don't think it was the Métis and the Indians, because Isidore is killed immediately, so is his Indian companion. And then a firefight ensues very, very quickly. The mounted police walk into almost a buffalo pound, and the fight is short, it's quick, it's bloody. The mounted police lose 15 men and about 40 odd wounded. And the Métis lose 5 men, and I think 3 were wounded.
And the Northwest Mounted Police withdraw, about the last time they ever withdraw.
They withdraw, but the die has been cast.
Something has to be done.
That's right.
Let's take a break here. We'll be back in just a second, because the second big battle of Batoche is about to occur. We'll do that right after this break. Welcome back. We're talking about Gabriel Dumont. We're talking about the Northwest Rebellion today, and we've just completed our look at the first battle. And Mr. Crozier of the Northwest Mounted Police has been given a bloody nose by the Métis, probably lost a lot of respect too, and has to hie back to his handlers defeated.
Yeah, he does indeed. And so they put an old regular army officer in charge of the campaign against what they think is going to be a long and drawn-out war. And this old army officer is General Middleton, and here's a photograph of Middleton in all his prime, and and all his buttons and badges and so on.
Yeah.
And so he leads several thousand troops into the Northwest. They come by train at first. And Dumont realizes this. He wants to carry out, and approaches Riel, he wants to carry out guerrilla tactics. He said, strike by night when we have to, hit and run attacks otherwise, blow up the bridges, destroy the rails, which he was capable of doing. They couldn't cover all of that territory. But Riel has been captured by another sort of mission, and he denies the permission for Gabriel Dumont to carry out a guerrilla warfare.
Well, did he still have a feeling that they could still salvage something? They could still meet and talk? And
Dumont felt that guerrilla warfare would bring all parties to the table. But by this time, Gabriel Dumont is really second in command, and Riel thinks with the victory at Fish Lake, they should continue in that, at least the victory at Frog Lake, they should continue with that battle.
so Riel thinks they can continue to win against the forces of thousands? I mean, the federal government must have some pretty good resources. It goes without saying.
Sure they do. They're well armed, they have cannon, and what happens, of course, Middleton lands, and he sends columns up each side of the Saskatchewan heading for Batoche. And as they go along, and here's, by the way, this is a photo of at the time of a column about 1800, and this is 1885, obviously. And there's another shot of the troops. They have stern wheelers on the river. The Northcott was one of the stern wheelers on the river, and so they control all the avenues. They have cannon. They even have a Gatling gun. And now,
is this regular issue in the Canadian government?
No, brought over by an American officer who was...
So there's some American interest in this too?
Not really. He was consigned to the company that actually produced the Gatling guns.
Oh, I see. He was a salesman.
That's right. He was essentially a salesman.
All right, so now they've got these columns.
And they're heading north.
And heading north to Batoche.
And what happens, of course, is Gabriel Dumont decides to delay them. He establishes an ambush at a little place called Fish Creek. And he's discovered by the Northwest Mounted Police Advance Guard. And here's a photograph of some of the Northwest Mounted Police Advance Guard that would be coming out of, they would come from places like Fort McLeod. In fact, this particular Advance Guard did. And they discover this ambush, so it's not entirely a surprise. But a battle ensues, and during the battle, it's quite a significant battle. And the Canadians are using cannon, they're using the Gatling gun, they're outnumbered. Probably they outnumber the rebels by 3 or 4 to 1. There are probably about 225, 250 rebels left at that particular time. But the results were rather interesting. It was definitely a standoff. In fact, about twice as many Canadians were killed. About 10 Canadians were killed and over 40 were wounded. 3 rebels were killed, or 5 rebels were killed and about 3 wounded.
Well, these Canadian forces are just not doing well against these people. What, can't they shoot straight, or what's the deal? Don't they know the country?
Don't know the country. The Métis and the Indians knew it extremely well, and the Sioux, of course, and the Cree that were with them.
So that could be sort of termed as nothing more. Fish Creek is nothing more than a sort of a momentary stopping this inexorable column of troops. And Northwest Mounties heading north. It's
a military victory as far as numbers are concerned for the Métis, but they don't stop the columns from going north. So the columns continue to go north, and they're right on the edge of Batoche. By this time, desertions are starting to affect Dumont and Riel. The Sioux go back, some of the Cree go back, some of the Métis disappear. They just kind of vanish. And so they're left with a skeleton guard of probably 100 odd individuals to protect Batoche. And the first day is a standoff, despite that.
Despite the cannon and the Gatling gun?
Despite the Gatling gun. It's a standoff, and Middleton is very, very cautious now, knows that Gabriel Dumont is a very, very talented leader who has good strategies. He doesn't want to attack, but some of the militia divisions, they throw caution to the winds. They attack anyway.
Day 2.
And their attack is successful. And the Métis and the Indians flee Batoche. Batoche is captured by the government forces, and but Dumont is not. He knows the country extremely well. He's armed with a carbine. He has about 90 rounds. He has a Colt or a Remington revolver as well. He has about 40 rounds there. And he shoots his way out. Essentially, he does shoot his way out. And he tries to contact Riel, but Riel is nowhere to be seen. They had been divided in the battle, and Riel is eventually captured, and he's brought to trial. And here's an artist's conception of the trial he's brought to. He is found guilty of high treason and sentenced to death. Since then, of course, he has been pardoned.
That was just, what, a couple of years ago?
Actually, it was, yes. And
so, I mean, this case of the minority fighting against or trying to get some consideration by the big guy, this is a classic case in Canadian history.
Well, it seems to be, and certainly when the lawyers and the judges examined the case, they felt he deserved to be pardoned. And so I leave it in their good hands rather than mine. So, and I'm inclined to agree.
So he is gone. Riel is gone, but Dumont is still surviving.
Dumont is a wanted man. So he has to head across the border, and he heads into the Dakotas, then into Montana. And when he heads into Montana, of course, his fame precedes him. He is now called the Napoleon of the Plains, you know, fighting against the might of the Canadian government and almost succeeding. And of course, everything is exaggerated. And Buffalo Bill Cody hears about him, and he approaches him and signs Gabriel Dumont onto the Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show.
And does he travel around the United States being the Napoleon of the West who nearly brought down the Canadian government?
Yes, he does.
Must have made just the audiences in the States thrilled.
Well, of course, because Sitting Bull was there, Gabriel Dumont was there, a number of other personages from the Wild West.
Gathered around him all the great heroes of the West, didn't he?
And so Dumont does this for a limited period of time, not very long really, but when he thinks the pressure is off, and hears from sources in Saskatchewan that they're not really looking very hard for him, he drifts back to his old stamping ground near Batoche. And so he goes into that area and settles down really as just kind of a semi-retirement, builds his own little cabin, and nobody looks for him. The
what
police
happened?
don't look
where
for
are
him.
These wanted
Federal
posters,
government doesn't look for them. They leave him entirely alone.
They had second thoughts about their role and his role, and
indeed
they'd like this whole issue to be kind of forgotten?
Very definitely forgotten. So he lives there until 1906, when in his 70th year he passes away just by natural causes.
Gabriel Dumont.
Yeah.
There's been a medal struck, of course, and this is for the militia, for the military.
And the Northwest Mounted Police.
And the Northwest Mounted Police. This medal would be worn by anyone who took part in the...
Victoria on one side, and on the other side it says...
Northwest Rebellion, 1885.
I think it just says Northwest.
That's right, Northwest Canada.
I believe.
That's right.
And that is not the original ribbon, but that is the original medal. And it gives you an idea. And of course the Mounted Police were...
well, this was this quite a substantial, had to be a substantial change in attitude to various people as a result of this whole event.
Well, sure. And the Northwest Mounted Police continue to patrol the plains and maintain the law. Yeah. And it was eventually, it was righted, generally speaking, slowly over the years.
Okay. What an interesting story. Gabriel Dumont, who always gets overshadowed by Louis Riel, I take it, which is, I guess, why you wanted to bring up the story today.
Yep.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Bill.
You're welcome, Mike.
The story out of Saskatchewan today, one of our greatest excursions away from British Columbia. I'll look at another great Métis leader, Gabriel Dumont, to 1837 to 1906, who did not suffer the same fate as Louis Riel. He lived out his life in Batoche and died in 1906. That's all the time we have for Gold Trails and Ghost Towns today. Join us next time as we continue to look at the history of gold and riches and great characters in the Pacific Northwest and other places as well. See you next time.